Picture what it truly means to support an organization that went into administration twice before most of their rivals had won a single major trophy. A South London institution that spent decades being written off, shipped in and out of the Premier League, forced to rebuild from nothing not once, but twice in the space of 11 years. A club that stood at Wembley 3 times and left empty-handed every time. That was Crystal Palace. That was what they carried into every season, every cup run, every opening day. And then, 164 years after the club was founded, something extraordinary happened. Not gradually, not quietly. Aberchi Eze swept across from Daniel Munoz into the back of a Manchester City's net in the 15th minute of the FA Cup final. Dean Henderson saved a penalty. Crystal Palace lifted the oldest. This is not simply a cup story. This is the story of how Crystal Palace became the most feared underdog in English football, and why that transformation was never an accident, never a fluke, and never the product of luck alone. To understand what Palace have become, you have to understand where they've been. Not just the football results, but the chaos, the humiliation, the institutional collapse that nearly destroyed this club before it could build anything lasting. In 1998, Crystal Palace were regulated from the Premier League. What followed was not a brief setback, but a decade of structural disintegration. Administration in 1999, a slow and painful crawlback towards solvency, then administration again in 2010, the second financial catastrophe in 11 years. For large portions of those years, Palace were a club surviving on borrowed time and borrowed money, the kind of institution that football commentators referenced as a cautionary tale rather than an ambition to aspire to. And yet, even through that, even through the courtrooms and the creditor meetings and the seasons spent fighting just to exist, something kept resurfacing. They won 4 playoff finals to reach the top flight, more than any other club in English football history. Each of those 4 wins came at a different venue: Selhurst Park in 1989, Old Wembley in 1997, the Millennium Stadium at Cardiff in 2004, and the new Wembley in 2013. That capacity to win under pressure in knockout football told you something real about the character of this club. Not talent alone, not resources, something deeper and more stubborn, something that refused to be extinguished regardless of how many times the surrounding structure was dismantled around it. And yet, for most of English football, none of it mattered. Palace were background noise, a mid-table Premier League fixture. A club that existed largely to make up the numbers for clubs with larger budgets and louder brands. The foundation for what Palace would eventually become was laid earlier than most people acknowledge, and it deserves to be stated clearly. Steve Coppell took Crystal Palace to 3rd place in the English top flight in the 1990 to 1991 season, their highest league finish in their entire history. They challenged Arsenal and Liverpool for the title that year and finished behind 2 of the most powerful clubs English football has ever produced. They reached the FA Cup final in 1990 and won the full Members' Cup the following season. When English clubs were readmitted to European competition after the Heysel Stadium ban, the UEFA coefficient rankings meant England received only a single European place, and it went to Liverpool as runners-up. Palace finished 3rd in the country and received nothing for it. That injustice sits quietly in the club's history, a reminder of how close they once came to a continental stage they would not ultimately reach for another 34 years. What Coppell built during those years was not simply results on a table, it was an identity, a belief inside the club that South London football could compete with the biggest institutions in the country, that the badge on the shirt carried genuine weight, that Selhurst Park could be a place where giants stumbled and left with nothing. That identity would be tested across the 2 decades that followed, almost destroyed at various points, but it never entirely disappeared, and when the right people arrived at the right moment, it became the foundation for something none of those supporters in 1991 could have fully imagined. The period between the Coppell era and the contemporary moment was not barren. Those supporters at the time could have been forgiven for believing it. The financial crisis of 1999 and 2010 had left a scar on the club's capacity to operate with the kind of ambitious infrastructure that sustained larger institutions. Points deductions from administration had meant that even when Palace returned to the Premier League, they returned burdened by institutional debt rather than momentum. The early 2000s saw the club develop young talent that would eventually prove valuable, but more often than not, that talent was sold to finance basic operations rather than retained to build something sustainable. By the time Palace secured their return to the Premier League in 2013, through that fourth playoff final victory at Wembley, the club had absorbed decades of disappointment and learned to operate with modest resources and modest ambitions. The supporters who filled Selhurst Park during those years had developed a particular kind of resilience, a capacity to find meaning and pride in simply existing as a Premier League club again rather than demanding genuine trophy success. That context mattered tremendously when understanding what would eventually happen. Alan Pardew became manager in December 2014 and immediately transformed Palace's trajectory. In his first full season, Palace finished 10th in the Premier League, a significant improvement from their pre-Pardew position. The following season, 2015-16, Palace reached the FA Cup final for only the second time in their history, and they lost to Manchester United in a replay, a defeat that felt particularly cruel given how close they had come to capturing the trophy their supporters had waited for since 1971. That loss remained fresh in Palace minds across the subsequent seasons. Roy Hodgson brought stability, but not the kind of progressive improvement that suggested a genuine upward trajectory was possible. Roy Hodgson managed Palace for 4 seasons from 2017 to 2021, accumulating a respectable points total but never quite reaching the heights that suggested a club capable of genuine achievement. The departure of Wilfried Zaha, one of the brightest talents ever to emerge from the Palace Academy, created an impression that the club was destined to remain in a holding pattern, developing players and selling them to bigger clubs rather than building something that could sustain itself. That perception was not entirely inaccurate during the early 2020s. Palace spent seasons moving laterally rather than forward, making the playoffs in the European Conference League, but generating little momentum. The managerial appointment of Patrick Vieira in the summer of 2021 was designed to inject a different kind of intensity into the club's operations. Vieira, a former Arsenal midfielder and Monaco manager, brought a tactical philosophy that emphasized possession and organization. His football was direct, aggressive, and structured, demanding that every player on the pitch understand their defensive responsibilities without ambiguity. Vieira's first season was chaotic, introducing new systems that took time for the squad to absorb. His second season showed gradual improvement, with Palace climbing slightly up the table and developing a more cohesive defensive structure. By his third season, in 2023-24, Palace had begun to stabilize under his philosophy, though results remained inconsistent and the club's future direction remained unclear. When Vieira departed in the summer of 2024, there was little certainty about what direction the club would take next. The appointment of Oliver Glasner felt like a genuine departure from the Vieira model, a different tactical philosophy, and a different interpretation of what it meant to build a competitive team at Selhurst Park. When Oliver Glasner arrived as manager in February 2024, Crystal Palace were sitting in the lower half of the Premier League table, a club with stability, finally, after 13 consecutive top-flight seasons since their 2013 return, a club record, but stability alone is not the same as ambition, and what Glasner constructed across his first full season in charge, 2024 to 2025, was something the club had never previously managed in their long history. Palace accumulated 53 Premier League points, their highest total in the Premier League era, surpassing their previous record of 49 points. They scored 57 league goals across the campaign, obliterating their own record for goals in a top-flight season. Their away form between December and April was extraordinary by any reasonable standard. Across 4 months of Premier League football, Palace did not concede a single goal scored by an opposing player on away soil. The only away goal conceded during that entire stretch was Mark Guéhi's own goal against Brighton, and Palace still won that match 3-1. 10 consecutive away league games without defeat, 4 straightaway victories, a record in the club's Premier League history, 13 consecutive league games in which Palace scored, another club record. Not in November, when those runs typically start and collapse within weeks. Not in February, when fixture congestion and injuries begin to expose every squad in the division. These were not the numbers of a team that belonged comfortably in the conversation about underdogs and overachievers. These were the numbers of something more deliberately constructed and more permanently dangerous. A team that had learned to be difficult to beat, regardless of the opponent, the venue, or the circumstances placed in front of them. By the time the FA Cup run gathered real momentum, Palace had already built the blueprint and proved it worked. The progression through the FA Cup represented not a sudden emergence of quality, but rather a continuation of the framework Glasner had spent months establishing. The early rounds against lower league opposition provided opportunities to build rhythm and confidence without the intensity that Premier League fixtures demanded. But Glasner used those opportunities deliberately, rotating his squad in ways that maintained fitness and sharpness across the entire group. When Palace faced stronger opposition in the later stages, they were not suddenly discovering a new level of performance. They were simply executing the tactical principles that had been refined across months of domestic league football. This was a team arriving at Wembley Stadium as a genuine force, carrying the momentum of an entire season's worth of improvement, carrying the belief that they belonged at this stage of competition regardless of who they faced. What the 2025 FA Cup campaign demonstrated, from the narrow 1-0 victory over Stockport County in the third round to the final itself at Wembley on the 17th of May, was the crystallization of everything Glasner had spent 14 months building. 5 clean sheets across 6 games. Only 1 goal conceded across the entire run. 3 of those clean sheets came against Premier League opposition. In the final, Crystal Palace faced Manchester City. The gap in the financial resources between the two clubs was almost too vast to calculate in straightforward terms. City, contesting their 3rd consecutive FA Cup final, carrying the infrastructure of a global sporting operation. Palace, carrying 164 years without a major trophy, carrying the weight of 2 previous final defeats in 1990 and again in 2016, carrying every supporter who had watched this club survive administration and playoff heartbreak and years of institutional uncertainty. As they put Palace ahead in the 15th minute, sweeping Munoz's cross in with the composure of a player who had already scored at Wembley in the semi-final, who had already delivered on the biggest stage available to him. Henderson saved Omar Mamouche's penalty in the first half, a moment that shifted the psychological weight of the afternoon in ways that pure statistics cannot fully capture. City created chances throughout, pressed relentlessly as the clock ran toward its final minutes, fired crosses into a Palace defensive structure that refused to buckle regardless of the pressure placed upon it. The final whistle came. Crystal Palace had won. Not through fortune, not through a solitary moment of chaos that could have fallen either way, through organization, through belief, and through the kind of defensive discipline that takes months to construct and a full season to fully trust. The broader consequence of that afternoon extended far beyond the trophy itself. Palace qualified for the UEFA Europa League, the first time in the club's entire history that they had earned a place in European competition. The first time since helping found the FA Cup in 1871 that this club competed on the continental stage. A club that went into administration in 1999 and again in 2010, that spent years rebuilding from financial catastrophe, now preparing for Thursday nights in European cities. The distance between those two realities is not simply a measure of football results across a single season, it's the length of an entire institutional transformation carried across decades by a supporter base that kept turning up regardless of what was placed in front of them, and finally rewarded in the most complete way possible.